Hello, welcome to today's Charities Lean Forward webinar, Safeguarding Charities, Fraud Prevention, Anti-Money Laundering, and Countering the Financing of Terrorism. This webinar is jointly organized by the Commissioner of Charities and Law Society Pro Bono Services. My name is Serene, and I'm your host. Please note that the discussion and materials provided for this webinar is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. With that, we are honored to have the Commissioner of Charities, Dr. Ang Hak Singh, with us today. We would like to invite Dr. Ang to give the opening address.
Good afternoon, my brothers and sisters. Thank you for taking this valuable time again to attend an online course that is jointly conducted by the charities and our LawSoc Pro Bono services. I must take this opportunity also to thank CAD and IAA for not only sharing but also participating in the panel discussion later on. My brothers and sisters, Singapore is unique. If you look around us, we do not have natural resources, and yet investors come and invest in Singapore. They do so because we are trustworthy, because Singapore is a trusted hub. By the same token, people donate to charity because they trust charities that the money donated will go to the intended purposes and the intended beneficiaries. Therefore, the question that I want to ask you is, are our charity vulnerable to criminals and terrorists? I think the answer must be yes. We must always on the lookout against criminals and terrorists for abusing charities. I'm not here to teach you to be a criminal on how to abuse charities, but I thought I will share with you 3 ways in which criminals can make use of charities for their criminal act. First is fundraising. My brothers and sisters, we rely on third parties for fundraising. We sometimes rely on people's goodwill because they do fundraising and then they donate the money to the charities. The question is this: can it be abused? An example is a person raised $1 million for the charities. $500,000 go to the charities, but the other $500,000 go to the pocket of the person. How can he do it? Well, he can have a scheme of expenses, bogus expenses, so that he can pocket the charity money. So this is one way criminals indeed can abuse the charity. The second way of abusing the charities is what I call the scam charities. If you look at some of the online fundraising, especially those overseas, you'll find that sometimes you wonder how come the same pictures appear in different charity requests for donation, yet it's the same picture. Well, the answer is simple. In today's modern technologies, it's not difficult for you to cut and paste pictures and then use it as a scam charities to appeal to the emotion of people who want to do good. Another way where criminal and terrorists can make use of charities is to make use of the charity assets and channels. This is an example of a washing machine. The criminals will give the money to the charity, but tell the charity that the money is to be donated to a particular beneficiaries, especially when the beneficiaries are overseas. So in actual facts, you have been used as a washing machine. Dirty money come to you, but when the beneficiary receive it, it has received from the charity, therefore it's a clean money. And that's how people wash money, and we must be on the lookout. So I'll share with you 3 ways of how criminals can make use of charities to pursue their criminal intent. How can charity protect ourselves? What are the safeguards that we can put in place? I frame the safeguards into 7 questions that you must be always on the lookout. Question number 1, always be diligent about the intent. When someone wants to give you $1 million as a donation, you must at least have a good idea of what is the intent. If you suspect that it's a malicious intent, then I think you better think carefully in accepting the money. The second question you have to ask yourself is, where is the source of money? Is it from criminal proceed, terrorist proceed? So know where the money from. The third question you must ask, the money go to who? Who are the beneficiaries? Especially when someone donate to you and say that I want to give it to a particular beneficiary at a particular country, and that country happen to be a high-risk country. You have to be on the alert of that. And then, if you are relying on people who raise funds for you, do you have an agreement? Agreement is important because so that people do not make use of the name and the reputation or the asset of your charities to commit an act of whether criminal or terrorist in nature. The fifth question is this: did you follow the money? Because sometimes the way the money is pilferaged is not at the beginning or not at the end, but somewhere in between. Did you follow the money and know where the money have gone to? Number 6 question is, do you have good internal control to ensure compliance with regulations and laws, both locally, and if your money is going overseas, also overseas? And the last question is, if something happened, do you know what to do? So I'm very happy that this afternoon, I have my brothers from CAD, Commercial Affairs Department, to share with you how to make suspicious transaction reporting. So my brothers and sisters, these are 7 questions you must be always on top of your mind when you want to protect yourself against criminals and against terrorists. How can I help? As a Commissioner of Charities, I always promise you that if you want to do better, I will walk the journey with you. In order for you to come up with an SOP, if you still do not have an SOP that frame around the 7 questions which I shared with you to protect yourself, then I think you should pull up a proposal to me to apply for our capability building funds. and use that funds to come up with the SOP, but more importantly, implement the SOPs. Secondly, I will continue to organize courses like this so that you are kept appraised of what are the best practices, what are the red flags, so that you can better protect yourself. And the last things that I can help is that I have been working with a number of charities, particularly charity that is working overseas, working to make sure to have quality assurance in terms of how the money is to be deployed overseas. One of it is the Red Cross. So if you want to have overseas operations and you do not have the channels, you do not have the quality assurance, you may want to consider established channels like the Red Cross. My brothers and sisters, trust is difficult to build, but it is very easy to erode. If we allow criminals and terrorists to erode that trust, then it will not only affect you as a charity, it will affect all of us in the charity sectors. Therefore, it's very important that we pay attention to building these safeguards to protect ourselves against criminals and terrorists. Once again, thank you for using this valuable afternoon time with us. And I will answer your questions during the Q&A. In the meantime, please pay attention to what our experts have to share with us. Thank you, and you have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Ang. Welcome to our panel discussion, where we will walk through case scenarios dealing with money laundering and terrorist financing issues. Joining us on the panel is Ms. Angeline Fu and Mr. Wendell Wong. Angelina is the principal founder of Keystone Institute and a certified internal auditor with the Institute of Internal Auditors. She has held strategic compliance and financial crime positions in ABN AMRO, Citibank, Philips Securities, SGX, and UOB. She was a member of the Compliance Task Force at the Institute of Banking and Finance and is currently Education Board Member at the International Compliance Association Singapore. Wendell is the co-head of the Investigations and Criminal Law Practice at Drew & Napier. He is highly respected civil, commercial, and criminal lawyer with over 20 years of experience. Prominent legal publications have recognized Wendell as a leading practitioner in dispute resolution, business crime defense, and investigations. He is the chairman of the Criminal Practice Committee and a mentor with the Criminal Legal Aid Fellowship of the Law Society Pro Bono Services. Thank you, Angelina and Wendell, for joining us today. A gentle reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, you can submit them through the Q&A panel. Our first case scenario deals with fundraising for foreign charitable causes. John is in charge of fundraising in Singapore Charity A. Country X has a national disaster. Charity A's director proposes for Charity A to raise funds for a volunteer group carrying out relief work in Country X. To save money on bank transfer fees, Charity A's employee offers to hand carry the cash to the volunteer group as he is flying to Country X to visit relatives. A key donor offers to pay the cost of shipping relief supplies to Country X, provided that he can include his personal goods in Charity A's shipping container. I think there's quite a lot of issues to unpack. Maybe Wendell, could I ask you, What should Charity A consider before trying to raise money for an overseas cause or group?
Oh, hi, Serene. Good to join everyone today. I remember what Commissioner started off by saying. So I guess my first response would be be inquisitive, right? Be inherently inquisitive to always question the transaction. And in this case, perhaps one of the overarching theme I would use would be for all of us to consider this proposition. Know the right things in order to do good. So in this case, the first thing that I think Charity A would have to consider is, in fact, knowing the legal landscape. And actually, unknown to many people, you actually would need to also apply for a permit before you embark on any sort of fundraising. And this small little things like that would actually help you navigate the landscape. So first thing, always ask the right questions. Make sure that you have, in fact, comply with the law and get a permit.
So for a permit, is it as long as it's an overseas cause or group, you need to apply a permit?
Well, Serene, as it says in the regulations, and I'm sure that the participants can see on screen, it's very detailed. Actually, it's very detailed. But I think the at the heart of what the legislation or the subset legislation is trying to drive at really is, as what Commissioner first said. I mean, what is the intent? I mean, you've got to know why you're doing this, right? Why are you trying to raise fund for an overseas cause? And is that the best way to go about it? Meaning, are there established channels, as Commissioner said, or should you be going down this road yourself, right, to do it yourself? And if you want to do it yourself, you've got to be mindful of the sort of legal requirements as well.
So does it matter, in this case, it's a volunteer group and not as, Dr. Ang said, the Red Cross, which is very established. So does it matter, or is it something that the charity should consider whether the overseas group is a volunteer group, registered charity, or reputable global charity?
Well, I guess, Serene, that's a great question. I mean, it's always different shades of how inquisitive you ought to be and how much you ought to question. I think as far as the public funds are concerned, my personal view is this. Every transaction matters. In other words, you need to scrutinize. Reputation counts for nothing, because as Commissioner said, and it's so true, that it takes a long time to build trusts amongst the different charities and especially in the local charity circle. But that trust can be eroded or destroyed in a moment, right? In a moment, if in any one transaction we are not careful as to who we're dealing with. So does it matter? I say it depends, but more importantly is the sort of frame of mind that you would embark on. And I've called onto screen even how the various sort of criminal possible liabilities that our friends at CAD had highlighted. But you can see that there is a really an armada of exposure that a charity
Yes.
can be liable for. So again, be cautious.
Thanks, Randall. I think that's so, that's important to note, because I think all of us, generally, I think the charities, they have really good intentions. They see that, Country X really needs help, and maybe in their enthusiasm, they may not, as you said, pause and consider all these factors, that even though perhaps it's a well-known volunteer group, it's still something which you need to look deeper into. So I guess that, because it's overseas and it's not in Singapore, how would Charity A know if the use of funds in the volunteer group is used for the intended purpose? Is it something that Charity A needs to follow up on? Or can they just donate the money and leave it as that?
Yeah, I think the at the heart of that question, and the response really is, do your best. You can never be 100% sure, and there is no foolproof method of saying, well, I knew for certain what the funds were being used for. But if you're able to satisfy yourself that you had a system, you have internal controls which allowed you to ask the right questions, and Commissioner also touched on this point, being able to sort of follow where the money is, I think it would help to satisfy yourself and your board and your stakeholders, right? That charity donor, that you have done your best in trying to ascertain that the funds reached its intended recipient or purpose. And you can see that there are really a myriad of obligations, even for the charities, even for our own charities in Singapore. In Section 12 of the Charities Act, you have a duty to keep proper accounts in the first place. So again, bearing that in mind, it is certainly useful if the charities have some sort of internal controls.
And I think that that's a very good point in terms of taking a look at the charity in terms of whether it has its own proper internal controls. And I think, as Dr. Ang had alluded to in his opening remarks, that they better make sure it's in place. If not, they may want to take a more cautious approach by going through very established channels. Angelina, do you have any thoughts on what processes that Charity A could put in place to, perhaps prevent or manage money laundering and terrorist financing risk?
Yeah. Hi, Serene. Hello, everyone. Like what Dr. Ang has shared earlier, having established internal controls, written policies and procedures are critical in ensuring that the charity manage and prevent money laundering and terrorism financing. So the few processes that I would recommend that the charity have in place would be in relation to how to conduct due diligence, verify the stakeholders, donors, grantees, beneficiaries, employees, including their partners. In that due diligence process, they should also have a sanction screening policy. Sanction screening is a little bit more complex, so there should be care in creating a proper policy to guide staff members. In addition to that, what CAD has shared, there should be procedures and to guide staff as to how to identify suspicious transaction reporting. How do they commence an investigation, ensure that there's no tipping off offense, and ensure that there is prompt reporting of suspicious transaction to the Commercial Affairs Department or the relevant authorities. There should be proper documentation and record keeping procedures as well, whether it's for accounting, for transfers, the funding and disbursement of donations. Those are very important. What is the criteria for funding and what's the criteria for disbursement? Now, having controls, having controls is not in, maybe I'll just end off with this. Having controls is not sufficient. You need to have the right tone from the top and the right culture from that is driven within the charity. So having a good governance framework is also important to ensure that staff are being trained, communicated of the code of conduct, the code of ethics within the charity organization. And of course, last but not least, there should be independent monitoring, independent testing by internal auditors or external auditors.
Thanks, Angelina. I think you brought such critical points in terms of governance and the culture, because I think in this case scenario, John is facing a tricky situation. He is an employee and, this proposal came from his director. So do you have any advice or how he could approach this with the director, because he doesn't want to offend the director by questioning his proposal to donate or help the volunteer group?
Yeah. This can happen, right? There are two scenarios. Yeah, there are two scenarios. The first scenario is that the charity may not have any established policies and procedures in dealing with money laundering or terrorism financing. And John may not be aware of it, of what AML laws or countering financing terrorism procedures should be. So the charity should have an open culture of communication to allow John to advise the director of his concerns or raise to the director any concerns he may have. So transparency and having an open communication environment is important to help the charity identify risks, especially if members of staff are aware and other members of staff are not. Training is also very important. It is not possible for staff members to be able to detect what is suspicious or identify what is suspicious when they are not aware of, let's say, what are the red flag indicators, what money laundering is, what terrorism financing is, and its nuances. Now, there is the second scenario where there are established policies and procedures, but the director chooses to ignore it deliberately. Now, then that comes to, I would recommend that the charity should have in place a risk escalation or whistleblowing policy in place. Now, this would encourage staff members, and in fact, the board should ensure that staff members have an obligation to escalate any risks that they see or potential fraud, internal fraud, or that they see where the proper channels, the normal channels are not available to them, and they feel comfortable and safe enough to escalate it to someone more senior, like a money laundering reporting officer or a senior member of the charity.
Thank you, Angelina. I think that that's a very relevant point, that one of the policies besides due diligence, they'd also have to consider a whistleblowing policy, because I think one of the real life case scenarios brought up by CAD was that some of the activities was carried out by someone very high up. And perhaps if that organization had a whistleblowing policy or that culture, as you said, maybe his actions may be discovered earlier. But let's say the worst has happened. The volunteer group is a sham and the monies are used to fund terrorist activities. I know CAD has earlier, I think, went through about the criminal consequences. But I think what I'm curious about, Wendell, is, given that it's a charity, would they, is there a different treatment for charities, or are they all viewed equally under the law?
Well, I think, Serene, first of all, the law would apply to them equally, but I think that the sort of impact on the erosion of trust in the charity sector, I mean, that sort of impact would far exceed any other ordinary case, right? Because we're dealing with public funds. And so I think when that happens, as our friends at CAD had already earlier shared, I mean, there will be a slew of criminal liability, but what is more is the erosion of public trust in the charity circle, which I feel would be far more damaging than individual criminal liability, because then the public might lose confidence in the institutions, right? In the institutions within the charity circle, and that then has a trickle down effect on how funds are being raised, whether that sort of trust is being eroded. But yes, they will be exposed to criminal liability.
Thanks, Wendell. And I guess a follow-up question to this is, unlike I guess a private limited company where you have a lot of full-time staff who can concentrate on all these processes, I imagine charities are also largely reliant on volunteers. So does it matter that perhaps most of the people who are looking after the processes are volunteers? I mean, would they be held to a lower standard?
Short answer, no. I think as Angelina has shared, I agree with her. I think it's important to have those internal controls, and perhaps my perspective is this, that regardless whether you're a volunteer or not, but if you take up if you step forward to be a volunteer in a charity, it could be in a staffing position or on the board, you have to know the right things in order to do good, right? You want to do good, I accept that, but it's about making sure that you know and you do right as well. And so I think my suggestion would be that charities should move towards that space where perhaps to guide the volunteers, a lot of these things and governance are actually written down in protocols, right? That can survive the turnover of volunteers on a year-to-year or basis, because institutional knowledge ought to be captured as to what are the best practices and governance as far as anti-terrorism financing or AML is concerned. Those are my views.
Thank you, Wendell. I think, as you said, that given that you're dealing with charities, which has further repercussions because you're dealing with the public trust, it's the public money, that all this should be considered seriously, and that anybody who steps up to help, whether it's a volunteer or a paid position, is something that the public trust in them should be taken seriously. So let's move on to Charity A's employee carrying money. Angelina, what are your thoughts?
Well, as a risk and internal control advisor, I would not encourage the carry of cash, especially if there is no security provided. Also, the carrying of cash bears with it inherent risks involving fraud and theft. So in this case, it's not very clear whether the cash is in which currency, but there are also foreign currency exchange risks that would be involved, especially if you are trying to bring across cash from one border to another. There can be fixed forex fraud and others. And there could be collusion between the carrier of the cash and the grantee or beneficiary. So I would not encourage the carry of cash. And in this case, it is because the charity do not wish to bear the transaction costs. I think then in this situation, the risk outweighs the benefit for carrying cash. Yeah.
Thank you, Angelina. I suppose besides personal safety, you carry over cash, and I think, it's basically not an advisable thing to basically hand carry the cash because of the fraud risks that you mentioned.
Yeah. So it is recommended, Serene, that they should use a approved established financial system to move funds, especially to the beneficiary or grantee.
Understood. So, Wendell, just curious, what would Charity A's liability be if, let's say the employee ran away with the money or misuses the money? And let's say Charity A really didn't know or they didn't monitor. Does it matter that they didn't have actual knowledge that the employee is, basically siphoning money off for other purposes?
Well, Serene, in short, I think it really depends on the facts of each case, but it would be a nightmare, right, for the entire management team if that happens. As Angelina said, I mean, the fact that you're carrying cash in of itself raises, and you allowed your employee to carry cash across borders, I think that in of itself would be a tremendous amount of red flags. All right, I would say no, don't do it. Right, don't do it. Say no, walk away. I think one of the sharing points I wanted to make was that, I mean, you always have a choice. As a charity, you always have a choice to say no, right, and to say I won't do it, right, I won't carry that cash. So I think for the management team or the board, whenever a scenario like that were to happen, always take a deep breath and take a step back and ask yourself, what is the intent? What is the purpose? What is the donor's purpose? What is my employee's intent in offering himself as a carrier, of that cash? Because otherwise, the sort of boomerang effect is tremendous in terms of exposure back to the charity, not just in a criminal way, and assume, let's say, that if the donor was legit, there could also be civil civil liability as to whether the donor may end up taking civil action against the charity as well for negligence, or related matters. So again, highly problematic. Caution, or more caution, is always the best advice.
Thanks, Wendell. And I think that's such a good reminder for charities in that, in the enthusiasm to help and the enthusiasm to, I suppose, make good use of money by perhaps saving on bank transfer fees, they should really just pause and think whether this is really the most prudent way. And I suppose related to this point, moving to the key donors offer, it's a little bit of a permutation where where he's offering to pay for the shipping fees, provided that he can put in his, personal goods in the container. So how should a charity A approach this situation?
Well, I think I start from a premise, as I've said earlier: be inherently inquisitive. Always question, why is he doing that? Is it to save $1, $10? Why is he being so nice, right? And if you question and you always challenge your assumptions about the donor or the reason behind that transaction, and I think it would put the charity's management on a very good position to then be able to say, well, I want to exercise more prudence, better judgment, and maybe we'll say, well, it's all right. You know what? We will absorb the transfer fees, right? It's okay. Why don't we just do it in this way, assuming all the other background checks or internal controls have been done. So again, question and challenge the assumptions in every single transaction.
Does it help if, because Dr. Ang did mention earlier on about, perhaps having an agreement in place. Would it help the situation if there was agreement between the key donor? Or is it still something that the charities need to reconsider or think about?
Well, having some sort of agreement might, on the surface, superficially sound like you're legitimizing the transaction or that you've done something. I think the fact is, I wanted to share that, well, but illegality, fraud, or criminal misconduct, that's going to unravel any contract in our courts. So the fact is that, well, you can window dress it with a agreement, but I always say, so what, right? What is the at the heart of the transaction? And as our friends at CAD had said, well, I mean, you can try to be smart about it, parking your signature in some corner of the check, giving the semblance of legitimacy. But when that house of cards starts to fall, then the question is, who is left holding the baby, right? And it would be the management team, it would be the board. So again, agreements sound good at the start, but really is at the heart of this, what is the substance of the transaction?
Thank you, Wendell. I can see we've received quite a lot of questions from the audience. And I also remind the audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to submit it through the Q&A panel. I would like to invite back Dr. Ang to the panel as we take some questions relating to this case scenario. All right,
Hi, Serene.
so
I'm back.
hi, Dr. Ang. Let's start, briefly for the, Q&A. I think one key question people have, I think, the good thing of this webinar is raising awareness that there's a need for some sort of framework. And I think one question that was asked to Dr. Ang is there a template or standard procedure that charities can follow? Or is there any plans to come up with a standard SOP?
I think very good questions. In charities, we must always be mindful of productivities. I find that we do once, and every charity start to do their own once. Question is, why can't we do once and many times? I.e., why can't we share? So at this moment, we have a guidelines on how to safeguard charities against crimes and terrorism. But I'm also hoping to learn from today's seminars to come out with a version 2. By the way, the version 1 is in our charity portal, but I think you should wait for version 2. It's going to come out within this 1 to 2 weeks after I digest what I have learned today, so that to bring it up to speed. So to your question, can we have guidelines that can be used by everyone? The answer is definitely yes. I hope that after I put the guidelines, you will download it and use it in your charities.
Thank you, Dr. Ang. I think your opening address is also quite, hit a chord with the charities who are listening in. And we actually have a request that your 7 questions that you mentioned, is there a way to have these list of 7 questions to be sent to the charities as well as the procedures so that they can refer to it? Because I think they may not have noted it down. Yes, go on.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. My brother and sisters, I'm sorry that I went through the 7 questions very fast. At the back of my mind, when you requested for the guidelines, I actually have something in mind to come up with an infographic. Thought that if I can present everything in a simple infographic, so that small charities, you don't require someone to understand and to protect yourself against criminals and terrorists. Therefore, please wait for the company's infographic to come up. But in the meantime, what I will do is this. At the end of the seminar, if you will go to my charity portal, we'll pull out a page of the 7 questions that you can safeguard yourself. But I think you should wait for the infographics. Again, I can assure you, it shall be out within these 2 weeks, after I've learned today.
Thank you, Dr. Ang. I'm sure the charities would find that useful. Wendell, I have a question from an audience member. Right now, we're talking about raising funds, getting a permit if you were to raise funds for an overseas organization. But what happens if it's a situation where the funds are raised within the organization for an overseas cause?
I think the short answer is again having to comply with the entire sort of legislative and legal framework. You still have to make sure that you have complied. But whether it makes a difference in terms of your own due diligence, whether you're raising funds just because you have been approved for an overseas organization, I think the sort of same test would still apply. I mean, the sort of same due diligence process, the internal controls must still be borne in mind, as Commissioner have said, because you are susceptible to being used as a conduit for terrorism financing, right, or for any sort of criminal misconduct or criminal conduct.
Thank you, Wendell. Thank you, panelists. Due to time, we'll move to the next scenario. But to the audience, please keep your questions coming in. We will have another short Q&A after the next scenario, and we'll address the rest of your questions then. So let's move to our next case scenario. And I think this is going to be very interesting based on the questions that are coming in, because it's based on fundraising. Charity Red from Singapore is looking for ways to raise funds. An unknown overseas charity, Blue, offers to do a joint fundraising campaign. Any funds raised will be split between the 2 charities. Sarah offers to donate $100,000 to Charity Red, provided that Charity Red transfers $20,000 of this amount to an overseas charity. A donor contacts Charity Red and said that he had accidentally transferred $100,000 to Charity Red's bank account instead of $10,000. He requests Charity Red to transfer $90,000 to a third-party bank account. Wendell, what should Charity Red consider before collaborating with Charity Blue?
Well, yeah, all the tough questions, right, coming to me. I should direct some of these to Angelina as well. But great question, Serena. I think bearing in mind that charity rate is still bound by the Singapore laws, right? So it sounds like a great deal, right? It sounds like a great deal. Someone offering to do co-fundraising with you. But you know, in the facts that we have explored on screen in this scenario, to me, it raises a lot of potential red flags, right? You have to make sure that you do your requisite due diligence on Charity Blue, because you, again, is whether that notion of sufficiency of due diligence, and I think Angelina was hinting at this, but bear in mind that actually Singapore is also signatory to a lot of international conventions on anti-terrorism financing and anti-money laundering. One of this is commonly known as the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. So under FATF, there are also countries out there who are on the sanction list, right? And if you are not careful, you unwittingly end up running afoul of even some of these international conventions for which Singapore is bound. So again, the short answer is sounds great, but really the amount of due diligence that has to be done, if it's an overseas charity, in this case Charity Blue, is even higher in my opinion.
Thanks, Wendell. Angelina, for Sarah's request, also again sounds like a good deal, but do you think there's any issues that the charity should be concerned with?
Well, from the case scenario, there is a risk that charity rate is used by Sarah to layer the illicit proceeds of funds or to hide the source of funds. The layering process are commonly used by criminals to hide the source and the origin of funds, make it difficult for enforcement agencies, investigators to trace where the funds come from. So like what Wendell said, what is the logic behind her splitting the funds within Charity Red and then requesting for Charity Red to transfer the funds to the overseas charity? So what's the intent and what is the benefit of her doing so? Well, and when Charity Red agrees to do so, it has to be very cautious because the recipient of the fund, which is the overseas organization, assuming it's legitimate, all right, would not be able to know, or the bank that transfers the funds would not be able to know and realize that the original source of funds actually comes from Sarah. What they see is Charity Red distributing or transferring the funds to the overseas organization. And Charity Red would carry with it additional responsibilities. The additional responsibilities of having to do due diligence on the foreign organization of which he transfers the funds to, and also it becomes very tricky when it comes to the reporting and investigating of suspicious transaction. Now, so the charity rate should have a very clear policy on whether it allows or it will collaborate or it would allow such transaction to take place. I mean, what's the role of charity rate? Is it to help funds transfer for its donors? So that's a very tricky question. And if, let's say, the overseas organization is actually a terrorist organization and on the sanctions list, now did Charity Rate do a sanction screening? Right? If it didn't do a sanction screening, I think it's going to be very complicated. I would think that the refund policy of the charity, as well as the policy on disbursements of funds, should address these risks.
Thanks, Angelina. I think you brought up some interesting points. I suppose for charities to consider, to put in place policies, or if they already have policies, to re-examine it to see whether do they address these sort of unusual situations, which whether, as you said, is to escalate it or find a way to deal with it. But let's say if Charity Red comes to know that the overseas charity is could be linked to a terrorist organization, or maybe have a reasonable suspicion that the overseas charity may be involved in illicit activities. Any thoughts on what charity rate should do in that situation?
First thing, they need to, like what CAD has shared, there are reporting requirements, regulatory reporting requirements. Terrorism financing is also a predicate offense under the CDSA, which CAD has shared earlier, the applicable laws and regulations. So there is a requirement for the charity to file an STR, as well as to make the necessary reports to the police commissioner. But they also need to consult, seek legal advice in relation to how the funds is going to be managed. Is it going to be frozen, or they just can't take that decision of saying returning it to the donor. So I would recommend that they seek legal advice, as well as to speak to the enforcement agencies if they have discovered that this particular organization is a terrorist organization. Of course, charity rate needs to be very, did they identify it before the transfer of funds, or they found out after they have transferred the funds? So these are the scenarios that charity rate would probably be encountering.
Thanks, Angelina.
Yeah.
So for the mistaken bank transfer, which perhaps is a slight variation of the earlier scenario, Wendell, what should charity rate do?
Well, immediately, I would advise do not transfer the funds to a third-party account. In of itself, to me, it sounds inherently suspicious already, and I would typically advise the charity to file STR straight away. One of the things I want to harp on today, in response to this question, is I think with the emergence of the sophistication of the crime syndicates out there, and our prominence as a financial hub in Singapore, not just in terms of the efficiency of our financial institutions to move monies very effectively around the region, I think all the more there has to be a very close collaboration between stakeholders, between the charities, between law enforcement like CAD, and even charities unit, MCCY side, and commissioner himself, so that when you have a very strong tripartite, what I call ring of protection, charities will not feel that they're being left to fight this alone, and that any sort of decision they make, might be punished subsequently, because they could really feel very stressed out in such a situation. So I agree with Angelina. I think first port of call, file the STR. Second, get advice, whether be it legal or even running to our friends at CAD to say, what do I do next, right? I think there are people out there willing to help, and knowing that if the charities are crying out for help in a genuine situation and not just crying wolf, I cannot imagine that our friends at CD would not come to their assistance to offer some sort of at least first aid or first responder type of advice as to what to do next, because that situation is as Angelina said, even in the mistaken transfer, highly suspicious and rather complex.
Thank you, Wendell. I think let's move on to our question and answer session. A gentle reminder to our audience that you can still submit your questions through the Q&A panel. We would like to invite Dr. Ang back to the panel as we start to take questions. So let's consider the questions submitted by the audience. So we have an interesting question that if a commercial enterprise, offers to a charity to donate money, but the understanding is that those funds will be used to purchase merchandise from it. So would it be considered as a form of money laundering? So maybe just thinking out loud, because I think it's a bit difficult to discuss things in abstract. So let's try and plug it to perhaps a possible example. So let's say if, it's maybe a clothes company, the clothes company says to a charity, all right, I'm willing to donate to you $10,000, but you must use that money to buy clothes from me. And from there, you use it to basically pass to your beneficiaries. So Wendell, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Again, remember, I'm a good listener. I sort of listened to Commissioner when he said, always also be ask yourself, what is the intent, right? What is the intent? It sounds problematic to me because there are layers upon layers. Because is the charity being used as a conduit for the private enterprises' own financials, right? In terms of its books, to give a semblance of sales, right? Whereas the true intent is to give a mistaken sort of reflection of inflated sales, when actually it could be that there was no intent to, that there is no circulation of those goods within the market. So again, I think the board would need to, the charity should sit back and think and ask itself, what is the purpose behind such a direction or request from the donor? Happy to hear views from my other panelists.
Angelina and Dr. Ang, do you have any comments on the situation?
Yeah, can I chip in? I fully agree with Wendell. My worry when I hear about this case, and when you see I smile, means that it does happen. It has happened. Okay, so there are two issues we need to address. One issue is this: if you are a IPC, Institute of Public Characters, and when someone give you money, the donor actually have tax incentive. It's called a tax deductible incentive. You have a 250% reduction in tax. And now you tell the charity that, okay, I give you the money, but you must buy goods from me. Be mindful that the IRA's ruling on this tax incentive is very clear. When you give money for tax incentive to the IPC, it must be without condition. The moment you impose the conditions, such as you must buy clothing for me or buy goods for me, you are infringing the act, and whatever tax incentive you have collected will be called back. And on top of that, the charity have to answer to me as to why did he give out the tax incentive is not enough. So that's the first question. What if it's not an IPC, it's a charity? I think that's where Wendell point come out very strongly. What is the intent? If the intent is for me to give $100 or $10,000 to you, so that you have to buy product from me, and the product actually is above market price. You know what's the intent? The intent is not charity, The intent actually is a marketing. Then the question is, I have to ask the charities, you can receive the $10,000. But when you start to buy things, the moment you receive the $10,000, the $10,000 is become a charitable asset. And the charitable assets, when used, must be what? The best interest of the charity. And you have a lot of questions for me as to why are you buying something that is above market value just because he give you donations. It's a two separate transaction. On top of that, there's what I call conflict of interest already, depending on how you position it. And if I want to make the issue more complicated, what if the company happen to have somebody in the board? Then I will ask really, is the decision made independent Is the decision make best interest for the charity? However, on saying that, I twist the scenario a little bit so that you all don't run away and say that, oh, somebody donate $10,000 and now further they want to give very, very, very cheap thing for the charity. Assuming that now I donate $10,000, on top of that, I tell the charity, you know, you can buy cups because maybe the charity require a lot of these cups. Outside, really market value is about, say, $5. You buy for me 10 cents. Hey, 10 cents definitely, you cannot buy this cup for 10 cents. And before you buy, you did a market check, and indeed it's the cheapest of the cheapest at the cheapest year, and the decision is one that is better for the charity. Can you still buy from the company? What do you think, Serene? What do you think?
Not
Hey,
sure, not
please.
sure.
How can you be not sure? If you have gone through the due process, and you, as long as your mind, the intention is very clear for the best benefit of the charity, and you have the process to go through, then it's a different story. Yes, you can buy, provided you must be very, very sure that you separate the donation from the buying of things that is of the cheapest. There are two separate transactions. But the only but is, remember, you must not only be independent, you must be seen to be independent. The only question you need to ask yourself is this: even though I buy this at 10 cents, but other people may not understand. So what is the word used? The word used is you must have full disclosure and full transparency. You must tell the whole world and be very open about it. And I'm quite sure as a donor to the charity, and I find that not only someone give, but someone want to really subsidize this cup costs $5, but selling at 10 cents, I need it. What's the issue? So I address conflict of interest, perceived conflict of interest, separation between donor and what I call selling in subsidies, and also to separate between IPC and non-IPC. It's an interesting case study, but has a lot of dimension regarding to charities. I hope I make it very clear.
Yes, and I think it was such a good point. And I failed the test. In terms of, you also have to consider conflict of interest, as you said, and that actually it's two different parts, because once the donor donates the money, it's now actually, as you said, it's now part of the charity, and you have to consider how to best use their funds. Angelina, I received a very interesting question. I think this webinar we've been talking about AML, TF, where the uses of the monies may be so-called washed or layered by the charity. So a question came in saying that is it okay to accept a donation from a suspicious source which has no strings attached? So they just give you the money and you can do whatever you want. So do you have any concerns about that? I mean,
this is a very mischievous question, cheeky question. Well,
yes.
if you know that the source of funds is suspicious, you certainly cannot be facilitating the transfer of the funds. So certainly, I wouldn't recommend that you take it if you are aware that the source of funds is already suspicious. That said, you still have an obligation to file a suspicious transaction report, even though you have not received the funds. So maybe in the course of due diligence or in the course of discussing with the donor, you realize that, the source of funds comes from a legitimate means, then you should decline it, but you still have that responsibility to file an STR. Yeah, so that's my feedback. Yeah.
Thanks, Angelina. Dr. Ang, do you have anything to add to that?
My brother and sisters, I know we want money. I almost to say that we like money. We need money. We need money to do good. But keeping in mind that the bigger objective is also about the reputation and the trust. If we just take money from an ill-repute source, even though the ill-repute source say that you can use whatever you want, but you know that it's from the ill-repute source. The question is that when the ill-repute source has been uncovered by police, CAD, or CPIB, the question is your reputation will be called to effect. Under the law, it's very clear. In fact, if you ask the police will tell you. Do you know what's my background, Serene? Okay, never mind.
I think
You Google me, you know my background. Okay.
okay.
If
My homework
I
after
give
this
you money,
webinar.
yeah, okay. Even though you give me money, if it's from a ill-repute source, and if I accepted the money, it's a criminal offense. Right? That's one. Now you are putting the reputation of the charity. Now it's a charitable offense. That's number two. Number three, you're putting the entire reputation of the charity, the trust of the charity sector into question when the case blow up. So, do you still want to take the money? My answer to you is, if you know it's an ill-repute money, the answer is no. Not only for yourself, for the greater good for all of us. You are not sure when someone give you $1 million, $10 million, and you're not sure, what must you do? That's where I agree with Angelina. Please make a suspicious transaction report to CAD. Yes, do that. And please also keep me listed. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Dr.
I
Ang.
hope that's very clear.
Thank you. Another question I received from the audience, I think now they have, it's come to their awareness about the need to do due diligence from donors. So there's two parts to this question. So the first part, I think, is, nowadays, a lot of charities are raising donations online, and some of the donations are anonymous. So for these anonymous online donations, are they expected to do due diligence on this? Are they allowed to accept anonymous donations? Perhaps, Wendell, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, again, all the tough questions are coming to me first, and then I'm going to refer to Commissioner after this. But I think the fact of online donations has been a big problem. It's a really complex issue. I mean, some have approached it, some jurisdictions have approached it on a basis of de minimis. That means, let's say there's a minimum amount or not, or you do check back, right? You do check back as far as some of these anonymous donations are concerned. But some organizations will even set, let's say, sort of like minimum quantum as triggers. And if there are big amounts coming in, whilst it flows into your charities account, again, whether that would still allow you to perhaps still file STRs, suspicious transactions report, as a secondary due diligence, that at least you have notified CAD, and should there be any problem, at least CAD and the authorities can help act on it quickly. Because nothing is, in my opinion, subject to what Commissioner, nothing is completely anonymous. CAD would have the requisite expertise to trace to a large extent, whether publicly or otherwise known. But nothing is completely anonymous. So again, it beholds and is beholden on a charity to flag out these transactions immediately to the authorities and even to commissioners, so that at least charities unit is aware and they can render assistance to the relevant charities.
Yeah. Maybe I can chip you to build on what Wendell have said, and I fully agree with him. This you need to adopt a risk based approach. Can you imagine you are running an online fundraising campaign. And now I insist every donor, whether it's $1, 10 cents, $50, you must check. What do you think? Practical or not?
No, not very practical.
Not practical. I want to be realistic with you. But on the other hand, someone you $50,000 online, you don't bother to check. And then on your record, you have not checked for the last 1 year. What do you think? Acceptable or not? Not acceptable either. So where is what I call the pragmatic way? The pragmatic way is you have to ask yourself, when you're doing fundraising, do you have a risk management systems? Looking at the quantum, looking at the frequency, looking at the person, because sometimes some person keep appearing, because even though he give you small amount, but he keep appearing, and you add up, the number is very high. So these are issues that we look at. But at the end of the day, if you have the slight suspicious, what must you do? I agree with Wendell. Run to CAD and me. Are we going to scold you because of this slight suspicious? No. I guarantee you, I can speak on behalf of CAD. No. Okay? So go for the benefit. Go to the side of cautious. Really, I'm more concerned about what? I'm more concerned about the reputation of Singapore. That's why I started my speech by saying that this is not only about charities. It has to do with the entire trustworthiness of Singapore. If Singapore is become a hub for criminal and terrorists, we're going to have a big problem. No one will come and sell out institutions. No one will come and invest here. What do we have? We don't have natural resources. What we have is our what? Trustworthy status that is worth protecting. I hope I give answer.
Yeah,
yes,
Commissioner, if I may chip in as well. Earlier I spoke about, I think especially in our circle of charities, it's important to encourage this ecosystem of a tripartite relationship, between the charities, the law enforcement, meaning CAD, and even your unit. Because I think if there is this tripartite alliance where people feel comfortable approaching each other for help, then I think, as I shared earlier, we can build this ring of protection around our charities and not be afraid to speak up when there's a hint of problem. And again, where the best practices are promulgated, even in such peer learning, I think it's very useful for all of us.
Yeah,
I fully agree.
Yeah,
I
agree with Dr. Ang and Wendell as well. And with regards to filing of suspicious transaction reporting, sometimes organizations, individuals are fearful about filing suspicious transaction reportings because they believe that they have more responsibilities and what's the impact on them. But I think in this regard, with the many years of working with CAD, the law also protects the filer. I think our enforcement agencies have been very open with working with the public to try to minimize the crimes and to educate the public, and including all organizations of these risks. So filing STR, truly like what Dr. Ang said, is to actually help the ecosystem. You don't want the same perpetrator of crime to approach another charity, and where the other charity's internal control is probably weaker because they are smaller and they have lack of resources, they become a subject of that crime. So it is really to protect the whole ecosystem. Yeah.
Thank you,
I just
Angelina.
want to, Serene, if you allow me to,
Sure.
I think Wendell touched on an important point. Don't come to us when you are 6 feet underground. Because frankly speaking, when you're 6 feet underground, everything will go according to the due diligence or go by the book, I would like to say. But when sometimes you accidentally, particularly when you accidentally step on something and you know that it's not right, but you don't have the intention, but the act is committed, but you don't have the menstrual, but the act is committed. And at that time, you come running to us and say, look, I have no intention. I accepted money from this guy. I have no intention. He's just coming through the system. Then I found that it's very strange. Every time when he donate, he put one whole stack of money, just put like that. And I find it very suspicious. You come to us early. I want to assure you that as Commissioner of Charities, my first mode is to help charities. I'm not, my first intention is not to hide along the bush and wait for you to do something wrong and then go and pound on you. Because what did I say? By the time I pound on you, the damage is done. The trust and the trustworthiness will already be done. What I corrected is only that charity and that's it. But damage done. I prefer to go for the preventive approach. And that's the reason why we spend a lot of time educating the charities so that they become our first line of defense. And the second line of defense is the coordination that Wendell have said. Coordination between us, the police, LawSOC. I'm very glad that I've signed an MOU with LawSOC because there are legal issues here that we need. So pro bono LawSOC step in and say, okay, we will now provide services, particularly to my small charity. My small charity, sometimes when they step on something, they don't know what to do, and yet they're scared. You know what do? They allow it to manifest. By the time you hit 6 feet underground, my brother and sisters, the damage is serious. So while it's 1 feet or half an inch, my question is, brother and sister, please come to me. You know my intent. No, I'm very open. This is an open forum. My intent, my first intent always is make sure that our charity, the trust of our charity are well protected. I hope I've given this assurance to our charities. Don't wait until it's too late. Wendell, I like your suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Ang. Thank you, Wendell. Thank you, Angelina. We would need to bring the session to a close. But before we end, I just want to check with Dr. Ang. Do you have any concluding remarks?
My brother and sisters, some of us may think that terrorism in particular may be too very, very far away. But I just want to share with you that many of the case studies that was been brought forward actually happened overseas. And if you ask me, are we vulnerable? I say, yes, we are vulnerable. Therefore, we must be always on the lookout. I try to frame the lookout into 7 questions. And I will make these 7 questions available. And what we will do next after this is to develop more case studies so that you can see how these 7 questions can be applied to build out our charities, not only to protect the charity against terrorists, but also to protect ourselves and also protect ourselves against the criminals. I just want to conclude by thanking you all attending making time to attend this conference. And I want to send a message that this is a serious business because it has to do with trust. And I'd like to thank LawSOC Pro Bono Services for co-organizing this with us. I'd like to thank our partners in CAD, Drew and Napier, Wendell, and of course IAA, Argentina. And please, if you have any issue regarding to this area, it's an important area, please do not hesitate to come to me. I promise you, I will walk the journey with you. Thank you, stay safe, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ang. I'm afraid we have to bring the session to a close. On behalf of Law Society Pro Bono Services and the Charities Unit, we express our gratitude to our speakers for joining us today and sharing their valuable insights. We would also like to thank all of you for attending today's webinar, and may you have a pleasant evening ahead.